Good morning. You guys want to learn how to be happy? Seems like a pretty good topic for Education Week, right? So I am so happy to be here, especially during Education Week, as someone that values education. I spent 11 years studying at Western. It's really important because it helps us to navigate through our life, which is great when things are smooth sailing, but especially right now, when we're in this very uncertain, unpredictable world, education becomes even more important. And I think especially, I always call to mind this one study that was done looking at uncertainty. And so research participants were brought into a lab and they saw pictures of rocks. And some of the rocks had snakes underneath and some of them didn't. And if they picked the rock that had a snake, they actually got an electric shock. And researchers measured both self-reported levels of stress, but also looked at pupil dilation, cortisol levels, salivary cortisol. And what they found was that when we are in the most uncertain times, that's when we feel the most stressed. It makes sense, right? Because when things are unpredictable, we can't figure out what's going on. And so we're kind of in that right now. And so the question becomes, okay, well, what do we do? How do we educate ourselves, and what can we do to start to mitigate some of those stressful or those difficult things? And that is where the science of happiness comes in. And so what we're going to do today is, so I taught at Western in the Faculty of Health Science for 4 years, and the professor in me cannot help but have like an intro slide. So here you go. We're going to talk about the science of happiness, because to be honest, up until the second year of my PhD, I didn't even know you could study happiness. So we're going to unpack a little bit of the research around why happiness is important and how it affects our health and our well-being. We're going to focus on what it impacts in our work. Then we're going to spend a couple minutes what I call rethinking happiness, because I learned a lot about happiness once I started studying it, obviously. And then we're going to talk about tools and strategies. So my promise to you is that no matter how happy or unhappy you're feeling right now, by the end of the session, you will have actual, tangible, evidence-based tools and strategies to be happier. Sound good? All right. So, especially I know here at Team LHSC, this idea of embedding joy at work is something that's really important. And so whether you use the word joy or happiness, it's really about when we feel good. And we all know what those feelings are, those positive emotions, right? And so actually, and a lot of people ask me, like, how do you even define happiness? Which is kind of hard, because I think if I was to survey every single one of us here, we may come up with different definitions, right? But we all have a general understanding. And so this is the definition that I use, which comes from Dr. Sonia Lyubomirsky. She's one of the most widely cited happiness researchers. And she says that happiness is the experience of joy, contentment, and positive well-being, combined with a sense that one's life is good, meaningful, and worthwhile. So whether we call it happiness, whether we call it joy, we want to infuse some positivity into our life and into our workplace, right? So, I have to say, the number one question I get asked when I tell someone I'm a happiness researcher, besides do you have a real job, is what's the magic pill, right? What's the one thing I need to do or buy or get or say in order to be happy? And the truth is, there's no secret to happiness, but there's a science to it. So just like we can apply scientific principles to learn about cardiovascular disease, to learn about nutrition, physical activity, we can learn about happiness. Now, surprisingly, it was only about the mid-90s that we started to see an increase in the peer-reviewed research around happiness, which when you think about it is pretty mind-boggling, right? Like up until fairly recently, we were focused on disease and what's wrong, and not like how do we live our best life ever. But I think if you look at the graph, what's really exciting is that you can see that recently there's a huge increase in the work. And I think the pandemic has brought that conversation even more to the forefront, right? We appreciate how much our mental health impacts our well-being. And this is across the board. So very much this conversation we're having today is a North American conversation, because happiness is different cross-culturally around the globe. But what we do know and what we do see is that no matter where we are in the world, we are seeing an increase in the research around happiness, which I think is pretty cool. So when I first got into happiness research, all my degrees are in health science, I started looking at the research in terms of the connection between happiness and health. And what we see is that happier people are physically healthier. So when we compare happy people to less happy people, we see things like they have better self-reported health. They have reduced risk for several different diseases. They slower disease progression, and also both an increase in their health span, which is the number of healthy years that we live, in addition to the lifespan, so the total number of years that we live. We see that they engage in a variety of healthier behaviors. And so not only does it feel good to be happy, we see actual, measurable, tangible impacts in terms of our physical health. This study was done before the pandemic, But what researchers actually did was they exposed participants to a live rhinovirus. So they actually exposed them to it via nasal drops, and then they measured their outcomes. And what they found was that even after quarantining them for 5 days, the people that were self-reported happier had less illness symptoms. So we really do see all of these benefits just from focusing on something that feels good anyway. And then we think about the workplace, right? We spend a lot of time at work. We're at work right now, right? And so what we see is that in the workplace, again, happier people have better outcomes. And this is even after we control for some of the things that we might think contribute to our happiness at work. Things like how old we are, how long we've been with an organization, our level of education. So even after controlling for that, we see things like happier people perform better. So a lot of the things that we want to do well, we see them increase. So we see more productivity, we see they're better leaders, they're often promoted more. And so not only that, some of the things that we want go up, and some of the things that we don't want go down. Safety instances, sick days, all sorts of things. So really, we're starting to see that happiness is more than just like a smiley emoji that feels good, right? And I think, especially since the pandemic, the lines between work and life kind of got a little more blurry, right? And what we see is that even in our personal life, happier people, they're more likely to marry, less likely to divorce. They have more friends, more social support. So a lot of the things in our life are improved too. We see they're more altruistic, so happier people are more likely to donate their time and or their money. We see things that they're more creative, they're more productive. So all of this is to build a case to say that guess what? Our happiness matters, and it matters a lot in terms of every aspect of our life. And not only that, this is research out of the UK published in the British Medical Journal. And what researchers found is that our happiness actually spreads 3 degrees from us. So when we focus on our happiness and how we feel, it not only impacts the people that we meet, but also the people that they meet. So that's pretty cool. So you might be thinking, okay, Gillian, that's all great, I get it. But like, what contributes to our happiness? And can we actually do something about it? Because I think we all know some of these like Eeyore type people, right? You know, the glass is half empty. And so what we know from research is that yes, we can, spoiler alert, and I'm gonna get to some tools and strategies. But when we think about sort of our total capacity for happiness, the 3 main players that we see are genetics, so they do play a role. Also, we see the environment, and we see our thoughts, our actions, and our behaviors. So we're gonna zone in on 2 of those in the talk. But first, I just wanted to spend a couple minutes of this idea of what I call rethinking happiness. Because when I first switched, I used to research childhood obesity. So when I switched halfway through my PhD from obesity into happiness, I actually had to like relearn a lot of things about happiness. Because did anyone here take a course on happiness growing up? No. So we were never taught, right? So no wonder we're confused, right? And so when I got into the research, I caught myself in this pattern, and we all fall into this a lot, right? This idea of I will be happy when, fill in the blank, right? I will be happy when I have X amount of dollars, when I get married, when I get divorced, whatever it is. And I actually caught myself thinking about that when I was doing my PhD. I thought, I will be happy when I finish writing a PhD about happiness. And so I thought, okay, this is a very problematic thought pattern that we fall into. And so the thing about happiness, though, is it's not a destination. We don't arrive at it. And this is a particularly pervasive thought in the workplace, right? We think, okay, I'll work really, really hard, and then I'll be successful, and then I'll be happy, right? And we'll grind it out, and we'll be miserable, and then one day when we reach that pinnacle, oh, hey, we'll be happy. But what the research actually shows is that the inverse is actually true. So if we're happy now, we end up being more successful. And so the idea about happiness being a destination is incorrect, right? It's not a destination. It's not something that we arrive at, right? Like, if you think about a happy moment that you've had, did it last forever, right? Did we arrive at it? Did we get it and then we're good? No, right? It doesn't work like that. It's not an end point, right? And so when we think, okay, so if it's not that, what is it and how do I live a happy life? If we want to live a happy life, then what we have to do is practice happiness regularly. Now you might be thinking, okay, Gillian, that sounds like a cute quote card to put on Instagram or Facebook, but like, what does that mean, right? And fair enough. And so this is my puppy Jocko. He was a puppy here. He's 2 years old, pardon me, now. But he's going to help us understand thinking about happiness. So as you can see, Jocko's gone to the gym. He's got his weights. And so say Jocko went to the gym and he had the best workout of his life, right? Or say after this, you go to the gym or do whatever physical activity you like, and you have the best workout ever. Would you take out your phone and text someone? I wouldn't text and be like, hey, guess what? I just had the best workout of my life. I've reached fitness. Would anyone do that? No, right? It sounds silly. We're laughing. Or say, for example, I made you this green smoothie for breakfast, and I put in all the superfoods, okay? Would you drink that smoothie and say, thank you, Gillian, that was so delicious, I've reached nutritional wellness? No, because what's gonna happen? Lunchtime's gonna roll around, and then what's gonna happen? We're gonna be hungry again, right? So we understand that if we wanna be fit and healthy, we have to move our body on a regular basis, right? And we have to choose healthy food on a regular basis. And so instead of seeing happiness like a destination, as something that we're going to arrive at, if we see happiness through the lens that we see physical activity or the lens that we see nutrition, it starts to change things, right? Because now what we've done is we've taken happiness as contingent on something in the future, right? I will be happy when? And we've taken it and we've brought it into, okay, well, what can I do today? And we're gonna get into some of the tools and strategies in a second. But basically what happens is, it's like when you go to the gym and you exercise, over time your muscles get stronger, hopefully, right? If you work hard, right? And so it's almost like we have a happiness muscle. And so over time, we do things, we put in the reps, we do things that make us happy, and our muscle gets stronger. And it's a very scientific graph I have here behind me. What you can see is that over time, when we do things to make us happy, then our happiness goes up. Now you might be looking at that graph and thinking, okay, Gillian, but wait, hold on a second, there's some red faces there, right? And it's because another piece of happiness is understanding a happy life doesn't mean that hard things don't happen, right? A happy life doesn't mean that challenges don't happen, that pandemics don't happen, that job losses don't happen, that illnesses don't happen. What a happy life means is that as we do things to grow our happiness muscle, when those hard things happen, and they will, you may be going through one right now, or a few, it's that we're more resilient to be able to cope with those difficult things because our muscles are stronger. Does that make sense? Okay. So I have 2 questions for you, and if we were all on Zoom, you could have put them in the chat box, but we are in person, which is amazing, and so we're just gonna answer in our head, okay? The questions? You're like, she's asking me questions this early in the morning. Oh, they're not that hard, okay? So the first question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you right now? So I'll give you a second, just take a breath. Okay, this is an awareness activity, not a judgment activity, by the way. And since we're in an academic institution, if you want decimal places, go for it. Okay, does everyone have an answer? Okay, good. Next question's a little bit harder, but it's multiple choice, okay? So say you won $10,000 in the lottery today, okay? And I said, congratulations, you've won 10K, and what I want you to do is take that 10K and spend it in a way to maximize your happiness, to bring you the most amount of happiness possible, okay? And you have 4 options of what you can do. So option A, you can go and buy a new wardrobe or do a home reno, okay? B, you can take a trip wherever you wanna go, whenever you feel comfortable to travel. C, you budget about $200 a week, a year for self-care. Whatever that is, whether you like to go to movies, buy yourself flowers, get a massage, whatever you like, you get about $200 a week for the year. Or D, you donate all of your money to your favorite charity. Okay, so show of hands, who thinks A, home reno, wardrobe? The women are like, yes, shoes. Okay, B, trip. I have to say that since the pandemic, the number of trip responses has significantly increased. Okay, C, $200 a week for self-care. Ooh. And D, charity. A couple philanthropic people over here, okay. So you might be wondering, okay, Gillian, what are the answers and why are you asking me these questions? Fair enough. Well, it's because, 1, the answer is C, $200 a week for self-care. And the reason that I ask those questions is because what we know from research is that as humans, we are pretty good at self-reporting our own happiness. So we're pretty good at figuring out how happy we are. So when I asked you on a scale of 1 to 10, if you were a participant in one of my studies, and I was to give you a fancy questionnaire, that's often how we measure happiness, and score it, chances are the response that you just came up with would be very close to what you would get on a questionnaire. So we're pretty good at figuring out if we're happy or not. But what's really interesting is what we're not as good at is figuring out what it is that makes us happy, right? So we often think that, we get a new wardrobe, we get a new car, that'll make us happy. Some of you are probably thinking, Gillian, you've clearly never lived through a home renovation if you think that brings happiness, right? Or we think it's the trip, or we think it's the moment that we give all of this money to a charity, but in reality, when we think about a happy life, it's really about creating small bursts of joy, small bursts of happiness. And so that's why the answer is C, $200 a week a year. It's because every single week you're doing something that you enjoy for yourself. And when you actually add all of that up cumulatively, it adds up to a lot more happiness than the trip or the home reno or whatever it is. And so I think that this is a really important piece of happiness because we often think that the small things are just small, right? It's like, I did one thing, I went for a walk this morning, right? Walked my dog. But really, they add up over time. And I think sometimes we forget that, right? But the compounding effect of those small things are not small at all. And not only that, what we see in research is that the frequency of your positive experiences actually has a greater impact than how much intensity we feel in that moment. So we really want to go after frequency. And if you think about it, when I talk about our muscle, right? So we're putting in more reps. We're getting stronger. And not only that, what we see is that when we do a small thing, and I use small in terms of time, not necessarily in terms of impact, it creates what we call in research an upward spiral of positive emotion. Now, I think a lot of us may be more familiar with the downward spirals, right? Where you have one thought, and then all of a sudden the world is ending or you're dying, right? So they go quickly down, but they also go up. Think about it. If someone gave you a nice compliment at work today, and then you got on your email, you're a little bit friendlier when you're responding to the next email, right? So that's the upward spiral that we see. And so what happens is when we do these small things, over time, that's actually how we get stronger. And so I wanted to spend the rest of the time, the bulk of the time today, really focusing on tools and strategies. Because I think it's good. We're all pretty equipped. We understand now that happiness actually has really positive implications for our physical health, our mental health, how we perform at work, and how we show up in our life, right? So now it's okay, what do we do about it? And fair question. And so we're going to zoom in. I mentioned that there's 3 main contributors to happiness. We're not going to talk about genetics because we can't change those, right? Maybe gene expression a little bit, but hard. But we're going to start with our thoughts, our actions, and our behaviors. Because we all live in our head all day, right? And we control what we do for the most part. And so what we know from research, and this is really cool, is that when we focus on our thoughts, our actions, and our behaviors, we can actually learn skills to be happier. And so all of my research focuses on this element of it because that's something that's pretty amenable to change, right? I love this quote. I'm going to read it directly. This is a quote from Dr. Martin Seligman, who, when I showed you the graph at the beginning, how in the 90s there was a spike? He was the reason why. We call him the founding father of positive psychology. And this is what he has to say. The very good news is that there's quite a number of internal circumstances under your voluntary control. If you decide to change them, I put this in green because it's important, none of these changes come without real effort. Your level of happiness is likely to increase lastingly. So we can do it, but it takes effort and work, right? I see sometimes those quote cards on Instagram, choose happy. And I'm it's not that easy. We actually have to work at it. It's like physical activity. It's like nutrition, right? And had to put some hometown data in here for you. So I did a study at Western with undergraduate students. And every week for 4 weeks, they watched videos that taught them tools and strategies to be happier. And so every week and this was just an educational intervention, so there was no behavioral outcomes at all. And what they saw, and I talked about how education is really important, right? So in this study, all we did was educate the students about the science of happiness, which we just talked about, and some tools and strategies. And even after just 4 weeks, we saw a statistically significant increase in the happiness of the students at Western. So it doesn't take a lot of time. But what's interesting is that at the end of the study, when I talked to the students and I said, do you feel happier? A lot of them were I don't know, maybe. Because it happens slowly over time, right? It's if you see a friend that you haven't seen in a long time and they've started exercising and eating healthy and you see them and you're wow, you look great. They may not notice as much because we live our life every day. But when we actually look at the research, the data was clear. They were happier. And so that's what happens though over time, right? It's a slow, gradual change. So now to the tools and strategies. Like I said, when I wanted to figure out where do I start, I think out of all of my work in happiness, I really believe that the best place to start is within ourselves, right? We can focus on other things, and we will, but I really think that if we don't focus on ourselves first, it's about as great as this photo here. So this is a parking meter, and it's solar powered, which is great, right? Clean energy, awesome. What's the problem? It's underground, right? So it's like we have really good intentions, but sometimes we miss the mark if we don't do things strategically, right? So we educate ourselves, and with happiness, we need to start within ourselves first. And so one of the things that we can do is what I call cultivating a happier mindset. And you might be thinking, okay, Gillian, what does that mean? Well, I'm going to explain it in a moment, but first what I'm going to do is just pause for a second. And this is going to be an in-the-head activity, right? So no talking out loud, because we'll confuse each other. I just want to invite you to read the paragraph that you see on the screen, okay? Take a second in your head, read this paragraph. How'd it go? Was it hard? No. Do any of you use Grammarly, the Chrome extension that checks your grammar? Yeah, I do too. Okay, so I listen to the Grammar Girl podcast, and I use grammar. I love grammar, and this really bothers me that I can read this. Because if you look, the first and the last letter are correct, but everything else is all jumbled. And so it's like, why can I read that? And it's because we think as humans, we're like these rational creatures, right? We think we're so logical, but we're not. Our brain actually plays tricks on us. And so one of the tricks that our brain plays on us in terms of happiness is what we call the negativity bias. So the negativity bias it's kind of like pre-installed software that we have when we were born. So we're born with this tendency to focus on the negative. So say, for example, 10 people today give you 10 compliments, okay? And one person says one bad thing. When you go home tonight, you put your head on the pillow, what's the one thing you're thinking of? The one bad thing, right? And that's because we sort of hit rewind and go back in history, we didn't live in this wonderful conveniences of the modern world, right? Like we actually had actual threats of danger going on all the time. But what's happened is our brain hasn't caught up with our modern world. And so our brain is always still looking for threats, looking for things that are bad. And so part of cultivating a happier mindset is one, understanding that we kind of have this pre-installed software, and then two, how do we reinstall some new software, right? How do we focus on the good? How do we not always focus on the bad? I'm going to explain how to do that in a second. But first, one more exercise, and this is again an in-the-head exercise, okay? So what I want to invite you to do this time, the words are spelled correctly, is to say in your head the color, don't read the word, okay? So say the color, don't read the word. So it would go like, I'm always nervous to do this, blue, green, purple, okay? So I'll pause for a second to give you a chance to do that. How did that one go? Was it harder than the first one? But it's like, why? The words are spelled correctly, right? And it is. It's a lot harder to do. And then the question becomes, okay, well, why, right? And it's because we actually had to pay attention to what we were doing, right? And so when I talked about how we have this pre-installed software, the negativity bias, if we want to override that, what we have to do is we have to train our brain to do so. We have to reinstall some new software. And so how we do that is what I call don't seek, like S-E-E-K, go out and look for happiness, but see happiness. Because we need to train our brain to look for the good that we already have in our life. And a lot of times people ask me, okay, Gillian, how do I be happier? What do I do? And I really think step number one, before we do anything, I mean, our plates are full, right? We've got a lot going on. Before we do anything, we can actually appreciate the good that we have in our life. And especially when things get busy, we're much more likely to not notice those things. And what's interesting is like, because I research happiness, I'm always asking people what makes you happy. And I have to say that before the pandemic, when I would ask that question, I would get a lot of things like the trip I just went on, or the new promotion I got, or my new car, my new house, whatever. Now, when I ask people that question, do you know what I hear? Things like going for dinner with my mom, giving my friend a hug, seeing a movie, right? Because we actually had a lot of good in our life, and we didn't realize it until it was taken away or restricted. So step number one, and the way we override our negativity bias, is we start to look for the good intentionally. And just like how we had to accomplish that task by what? Slowing down, right? You probably just slow down to do it. You had to focus. It required a bit more energy in order to accomplish that task. And we have to do the exact same thing with happiness. We have to actually intentionally work to notice the good. But what we know from the psychology of behavior change is that change is always hardest at the beginning, right? It starts to get easier. Like, did anyone here really have to work today to brush their teeth this morning? No, probably not, right? Why? Because since we were young, we learn and we wake up, we brush our teeth. It's a habit. So the same thing happens with happiness. We start to cultivate that habit. Now, that sounds all well and good until we live life, because life is busy, right? It's kind of like life is, I almost think of it like a Where's Waldo book, right? Where there's a lot going on. It's like, okay, we don't see happiness, but like, look at all these things. How do we do that? And so it's exactly like I said. And by the way, there's Waldo. We actually have to pay attention. We have to do work. We can't just choose happiness. We have to actually deliberately start to do that. But we can remind ourselves that over time, it gets easier. Now, in terms of thoughts, actions, and behaviors, in terms of our behaviors, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I feel like we all know that we're supposed to exercise and we're supposed to eat healthy and we're supposed to sleep, right? We know this. And yet, life is busy, and sometimes we don't. But I wanted to acknowledge that when we think about those things, all three of these, I call them the foundational three, because they are really important. I'm just going to say two quick things. This is a quote from Dr. Sonia Lyubomirsky, who I shared her definition of happiness with you in the beginning. She says that exercise may be the most effective instant mood booster. And I think sometimes that's important to know because it could be like mid-afternoon and we're getting a little snarky, right? And so what do we do to shift our mood? Because a lot of the things like cultivating a happier mindset, it takes time. But sometimes we need to shift our mood right in the moment. And so moving our body, whether that be going for a walk, putting on a song, having a dance party, sometimes the best way to shift our mood in the moment is to move our body, even if we don't feel like it. And I think it's important to know it doesn't need to be a lot. Research shows that even 10 minutes of physical activity a day greatly increases your odds of being happy. And the physical activity benefits are cumulative. So if you park far away and walk, and then at lunchtime you go for a walk, those add up. And over time, they really do have an important implications in terms of our happiness. So now that we've talked about our thoughts, our actions, and our behaviors, we're going to switch to environment, because this is the third big piece of the happiness equation. And our environment matters, right? We all know what it's like when we're in a good environment and when it's not, and how it affects our mood. I think when we think about lockdown and how that affected our mood, right, when our environment was restricted. And so we're going to zoom in on a couple things. But first, I wanted to share with you, this is one of my favorite studies. I love it so much, I talked about it in one of my TEDx talks. And what researchers did in this study was they brought participants into a lab, and they divided them into two groups, okay? So the first group, they listened to what's called a hedonically neutral piece of music. So it's just kind of like elevator music, right? Not too exciting. And then the other half of them were given a hedonically positive song. So like a bright, upbeat type of music, okay? So there's two groups, neutral music, happy music. And then within each group, they were subdivided. Half of the participants were told, just listen to the music. The other half were told, listen to the music and try to be happy while you listen to it, okay? So we have 4 conditions. Neutral music, just listen. Neutral music, listen and try to be happy. Happy music, just listen. Happy music, try to be happy. Got it? And do you want to know what happened? So here's a graph, and what you can see is that the only bar that increased is the people that, 1, listened to the happy music, but 2, also tried to be happy. And I think this is important, right? Because our environment matters, but it's not enough. We actually still have to put in the work. So we need to create an environment that's conducive to our happiness, but we also have to work at it too. And so, okay, how do we do that? And I think sometimes I think about our environment, especially maybe our environment at work, it can almost feel like an impossible thing. Like, how do I control our environment? It's such a huge institution at the hospital, right? Like, what do I do? And so the way I think about how do we change that environment, it's not like there's a huge overhaul that's going to happen. That's an impossible thing. But what's possible is that we start to make slow changes, either within ourselves if we're a leader, or within the team if we're part of a team. And what happens is over time, things change. It's like, this is a picture of the iPhone from the first generation, and it only goes till the 6th. We're at like, what, 14 now? Something like that? Imagine. Okay, I was talking to a group of students at U of T last week, and I was showing this slide, and I said, I remember when I first got a camera phone. Do you remember that? And they all looked at me. They're like, no, I don't. But I do. Do you remember getting your first camera phone? And I thought it was like the best thing in the world, and I took pictures of everything. And now if you look at this photo, like look at this strawberry, right? It's not bright. The colors aren't very vivid. And so it's like, okay, but every generation of the iPhone, what happens? Picture get a little bit sharper, colors get a little bit brighter, more vivid, and that's how we change our environment too. We do little things that over time, when we look back, actually add up, and they do matter. And I think sometimes we feel like in the moment these little things don't matter, right? But it's like I talked about, these small things really do add up. So how do we change our environment? What do we do? What are some of the smaller things that we can do, whether it's for ourselves or for people we lead or people we know? And one of the things that we can focus on is what is called autonomy. And so the definition here from the APA Dictionary of Psychology says that autonomy is the experience of acting from choice rather than feeling pressure to act. So essentially what autonomy means is like, there are some things in our life that we can control, right? And there are some things in our life that we cannot control. And autonomy means choosing to give more of our focus, more of our energy, more of our resources to the things that we can control. And so it's actually a really big player. So much so that autonomy is more of a predictor of our happiness than how much money we have, how popular we are, how good looking we are, or how good our sex life is. So I think we can like look at this thing and be like, oh yeah, I see how those would impact my happiness. But autonomy is more of a predictor than all four of those. So it's something that really does matter. And autonomy, I think especially in an environment where we don't feel like we have a lot of control, it can feel like almost overwhelming. Like, how do I even find what I can control? And this is probably in the happiness space, one of the biggest landmark studies, and it was done in 1977. A researcher from Yale and one from Harvard went into a nursing home. And what they did was so the nursing home had 4 floors. They used 2 of them. And so on one floor, participants were just sort of par for the course. They were sort of like almost like a control group. And then in the other one, what the researchers did was they came in and they gave the residents of the nursing home autonomy over seemingly small things. Like, what movie do you want to watch on movie night? Or do you want a plant in your room? If so, which one? Pick it, and they brought them. So these tiny little opportunities where they would have some control. And what they found was that the residents that were in the autonomy on the floor where they had choice, they had improved health, they had more vigorous activity patterns, they were up and mobile more often, they were more actively interested and engaged in their environment, they were most social, their mood didn't decline, and this last one's a big one. They had lower mortality rates, like actual mortality rates. So what they found was that the people that were in, the researchers called it a responsibility-induced group, but out of them, so there was 47 of them, and so 15% of them passed away in the 18 months following the study period, as compared to the comparison group where they saw 30%. So half of that. So even just simple things like what plant do you want can really have a big impact, not only in our mood and our behavior and our performance, but even things like mortality, which is wild, right? And so you might be thinking, okay, Gillian, well, that study was done in like 1977, right? So like, But in 2021, a review paper came out that looked at 46 studies very similar. And again, what they found was that older people's perceived autonomy, right? So where can I give choice, or can I perceive that I have choice? That what it did was it improved both the quality of life and the health of the residents. And so I think that, and this is another piece from the study, they said that professionals, so it was the nursing home staff, it was the physicians, the nurses, when they were able to facilitate autonomy, so give them choice when they could, from little things like day-to-day management, like do you want to do this now or that now? So wherever, we think about that in our life, it's like where can either I find choice or I give someone else choice? Like, does it matter if someone comes in at 9 or 9:30? If it doesn't, then there's a choice, right? Does it matter? Like little things, they're not that little. That's kind of a theme of today. So the question becomes, okay, well, where can we create some autonomy in our life, right? Asking that question. Maybe not this. I used this picture once, and I had someone put up their hand, and I was like, yeah, and they're like, what happens if they go over a curb? Right, so we can't do everything alone, but there are areas of opportunity if we actually pay attention and start to notice that can impact our happiness. Now, the next thing that we can do, which great news, we're doing it right now, is connection. And I wanted to bring this up because I think it's a very powerful thing. So much so that this is a quote from Dr. Robert Waldinger. And he is currently the lead researcher in the longest running longitudinal study that looks at happiness. It's called the Harvard Study of Adult Development. If you like this, he actually just had a book come out this year called The Good Life. And I'm not ruining the book, but the punchline of the book is that social connections make us happier and healthier. So much so that one of the conclusions from the study is that the number one predictor of both our long-term health and our happiness is social connection. Above how much money we make, above our age, our gender, our race, our education level, the number one thing is social connection. And he says, the lessons that came from tens of thousands of pages of research was that good relationships keep us happier and healthier. And so we also see the opposite, right? So lack of connection, loneliness, can be as detrimental to our health as alcoholism or smoking. So this is something I think that when we get busy, it's very easy to have spending time with a friend drop off our list, right? Or to take time to make a phone call. And yet connection is really, really powerful. This is a cartoon. Waldo's at the bar. We found him. And it says, nobody ever asks, how's Waldo? I know, right? But it's because when I talk about connection, right, it's not just like, hey, how are you? We actually have to connect with people. But the caveat to that is that when we think about connection, I don't know about you, but when I think about it, I think about the deep friendships that I have, the people that I call when something's going wrong. My best friend is sitting at the back here. She's not paying attention, but there she is. She is from London, so she came to watch me today. And so I think about connection, I think about her and I. But when we think about connection, it actually goes beyond that. And I love, this is a study, I actually just put this in because it just came out, it's hot off the press. But what researchers did was they looked at how people felt before and after a conversation with someone they didn't know very well. And so what you see is the red is how they feel before the conversation, and then the blue is after. And what we see is that across every age demographic in the study, people felt better after the conversation, both introverts and extroverts. And so I think sometimes we don't understand, or we have a conversation and then we go about the day. But what we don't realize is that the residue of that, or the implication of that, really does matter. And I think when we think about conversations, it may be more salient if I call Liana and I'm like telling her about something difficult that's going on. But like if we're just chatting right after this for 5 minutes and I go, it's not so salient in my memory. And yet what we see is that it does have very big implications. Another big one, and this is done with people that were talking to strangers. And so this study was done over 7 days. And every day, the participants had to talk to strangers, both introverts and extroverts. And the reason that I like this study is because it was required every single day. And I talked about how small bursts add up, right? So it wasn't just one interaction. They actually had to do this repeated for an entire week. And what we see is that they were less awkward, they had more enjoyment, and they felt better overall. So it's not just like a once a month I have to talk to somebody kind of situation, but knowing that when we actually talk to people, especially people we work with, right, that we may not see all the time or whatever, we think that those things don't matter, like chatting by the coffee machine in the morning or something like that. Before I did my master's, I worked at the Middlesex London Health Unit for a year and a half in their research department. And I used to love going to the kitchen and getting coffee because there was always snacks there. And people were always making things. And it was like one of my favorite parts of the day because you got to just chit chat with other people from the health unit, from different departments, people I didn't know. And when I look back now, knowing the research that I do, it's like, oh, it's because those small conversations actually weren't so small. And they do really matter in terms of how we feel. Sometimes we sort of hear them referred to as water cooler moments, right? The sort of conversation, you're having a situation and you're just chit-chatting at the water cooler. In research, we don't call them water cooler moments. We call them face-to-face spontaneous conversations. You can never keep it simple, right? And so what we see is that there's two types of face-to-face conversations, right? The spontaneous ones. There's work-related and there's non-work-related. And what we see is that when we have these face-to-face spontaneous conversations that are work-related, right? So we're talking about work, something that's going on with a patient or a challenge that you're having with someone on your team, whatever it is. In terms of idea generation and innovation, those are the most effective type of conversations that we can have. And we found that teams that were unable to compensate virtually. And I get this a lot, right? Like, what's the difference between virtual and being together? And when we're virtual, we lose this entire part of the conversation, these spontaneous ones. Because does anyone log on to Zoom and then chit chat, right? No one, because either there's a whole bunch of people and then like 2 people are talking, everyone else is eavesdropping on their conversation. Or we log on, we do our meeting and we get off. We miss the when people are walking in and we're chatting. And it was so cool. I know so many of you today. It's really awesome to be back in London and to have those spontaneous conversations. And I bring that up because I think it's important because we don't really realize the implications of that. Now, the last one that I want to focus on is appreciation. So sometimes referred to as appreciation, sometimes gratitude. Now I'm curious, has anyone here ever practiced gratitude? Show of hands. Okay, couple, good. What practicing gratitude means, it's very easy. We just think about things that we're thankful for, things that we appreciate. That's it. And it doesn't take a lot of time. What I love about it, it doesn't cost anything. Very low in terms of time that it takes, and yet quite high in terms of impact. And what we see that when we induce gratitude, we can see that it counteracts materialism, that it boosts happiness, it boosts our well-being, and increases our life satisfaction, and even decreases stress, which, if you remember at the beginning of the talk, we talked about how we're in a very stressful situation right now, right? So this is a good antidote to that. And in the workplace in particular, this is something that actually has very positive effects. We see things like people have more positive emotions at work when they feel appreciated or when they appreciate somebody else. Less stress, we see less health complaints, more satisfaction, even things like fewer sick days. So I led a study in partnership with a colleague of mine at the University of Toronto, Dr. Ramit Billen, and the Canadian Mental Health Association in 2020. And we led a study where we looked at happiness in the workplace. And we had participants from all across the country, and we looked at a variety of different outcomes. By the way, we did this data collection in January and February of 2020. And so, quick aside, March 20th is the International Day of Happiness. It's the busiest day of the year for me, right? And so I had planned, because I do a lot of media, I had leveraged every single media connection I have to be on every show on March 20th. And then what day did lockdown happen? 16, 18, something like that. So I call my colleague and I'm like, what do we do? How do we go on and talk about happiness at work when nobody's happy and nobody's at workplace? And so we were kind of bummed for a while because we're like, this data is kind of no good anymore. But what we realized after is that we have a huge national data set with a snapshot of how Canadians felt at work right before the pandemic. And so we're going to do a second time point in a little bit and follow up. But I wanted to share one of the things that we found, which was that was pre-pandemic. Less than half of Canadians felt appreciated at work. Less than half. And so this is something that's really important because I think in our total life, what we see is that 50% of people do show some form of gratitude to their family, so to people in their life, but only 15% do with their colleagues. And yet, how much time do we spend at work? Some of us probably spend more time at work than we do with our family, right? And yet we're not showing that level of appreciation. In fact, the workplace ranks the last place where people are inclined to say thank you. And I think especially in healthcare, when we care about people, it's like, okay, wow, this is an area of opportunity where we can actually have very meaningful impact. And a little bit of gratitude goes a long way. Because you might be thinking, okay, how do I show appreciation? What do I do? We think about, okay, when something's done well, even if it's a small task, it's not a huge project, we may not think that giving kudos or acknowledging someone is important, and yet it is, even in meetings. How often do we start a meeting with what's going wrong right at the beginning? Right? So focusing, maybe starting with what's going right or a celebration or a win. Even in one-on-ones, when we do evaluations and feedback, I think it's just as important to focus on what we're doing well than what we're not, right? Or where we have room for improvement. Or there's a fun exercise called a gratitude jar. Have any of you heard of gratitude jar before? Yes, a couple of them, okay. So essentially a gratitude jar is you put things that you're thankful for in the jar. And then if you're having a bad mood or you want to just go in, you pull them out and you read them. This is actually a great activity if you're a parent or you have children, to have them start to practice gratitude. And then when they're in a bad mood, sometimes it's a good task that they can go and pick one out and help shift their mood. So I did the opening plenary for the American Society of Addiction Medicine conference in DC in the spring. It was actually during cherry blossom season. So I got to go to DC when all the cherry blossoms were blooming. It was beautiful. And so I gave an addiction medicine conference. The opening talk was about happiness. And So I was talking about all the things that we're talking about today in this gratitude jar. And so there were some colleagues of mine that were there that were from CAMH, from the Center of Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. So I do the talk, go home, right? And then I was at CAMH 2 weeks ago visiting a colleague of mine. And he said to me, Gillian, come here, I want to show you something. So he runs the nicotine department there. They have an 80-person lab at CAMH, and he goes over and he comes over and he runs and he shows me this. And so he's like, we made a gratitude jar here. And so at CAMH in his department, what they do now is they have this jar, and people put things that they're grateful for in the jar, and the way they start their meetings